the cloud. All right. Should be enough memory on the cloud to record this. All right. So happy Friday, everybody. I want to give you some announcements to start with. The Department of Biological Sciences is in need of a new animal caretaker and a new greenhouse caretaker for next school year. And we like to get students who are fairly early in their academic career at Bethel so that we can train somebody and have them for the next 2 or 3 years. So if you enjoyed the fish or want to have a role in taking care of the animals, we also house mice and rats in our facility. And if you're interested in taking care of them, or if you're interested in taking care of plants in the greenhouse, you should have, all biology majors should have received an email from Brent, our lab coordinator, about that. So send him an email if you're interested. I think it's a pretty good job. We, our current caretakers, I think, are graduating, and that's why we're looking for a new one. Also, I am still working on grading your research papers. I have about half of them done. And I won't make excuses, but yeah, it's just taking me a while. So I'm going to delay the deadline of the resubmission to the end of finals week. And so some of you have already revised your research papers, and when you have revised, you can just submit your revised version to the same assignment that you submitted your first one to. And then I will be able to see both of those assignments, and I'll be able to see whether you have followed my suggestions for improvement. And then hopefully that'll expedite my grading process. But I won't start grading the revisions until I've graded all of the first time submissions. So it'll be a while before I look at those. Thank you for your patience. Also, make sure you check the Moodle gradebook and your Moodle calendar and Mastering Biology to make sure you're up to date on assignments. Probably after our final, I will go through and convert any blanks to zeros. So make sure that you catch up on all your assignments. If you're late on anything, go ahead and submit it. Even if you're past the deadline, don't think that you've missed it forever. And that goes for the research paper too. If you never submitted your research paper, you can still do that. Yeah, and then any questions on any of that? Okay, so it's not too late to submit any of those assignments. And don't forget your homework from last Friday's lecture, which I will remind you about. This was our problem from last Friday's lecture. And the question was, if you have a carbon atom in a molecule in the blubber, so that would probably be a lipid molecule, right? That in the blubber, in the fat of the minke whale. If you have a carbon atom in that blubber of the minke whale, how would that carbon atom become part of the crab-eater seal? And notice that the crab-eater seals do not eat the whales. And so your assignment was to make a drawing that shows the movement of the carbon atom and also provide a written description of the steps that the carbon atom must take. And you need to describe which biological processes. So just an arrow from the minke whale to wherever isn't good enough. You have to describe the process that's involved. And so this should kind of help you integrate what you've learned this semester, the different topics. And many of you have already submitted that, and those of you that submitted by 10 o'clock, those are graded. And so then you can look at those. And if you have not yet submitted, it's not too late. So make sure you do that. All right. Now, we started talking in Wednesday's lecture about how humans are changing the earth. And this is where all of the information that we've learned this semester is going to be applied. And so these last 2 weeks, I think, are just kind of the heart of what we've learned. I mean, we've learned a lot about cellular processes and organismal processes. And now as we're looking at the ecosystems as a whole, we're really applying those cellular and organismic processes. And this is where I think this course gets really like important. Like this is where we see why we needed to learn all of this stuff. How does this affect our environment, and why should we care about that? And so our learning objectives that we're working on are to describe how human activities can lead to nutrient enrichment, which we covered Wednesday, the last few slides of Wednesday's lecture, and then the consequences of nutrient enrichment. And the question I left you with was this third bullet here, which is ways to reduce the ecological effects of nutrient enrichment. So we'll review that, and then we're going to look at biological magnification, and then we're going to look at the evidence that CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. And we're going to look at the greenhouse effect. So nutrient enrichment has to do mostly with the nitrogen cycle. So just to remind you of this, the nitrogen cycle, we've got a big reservoir of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but this nitrogen in the atmosphere is not in a form that most organisms can use. And so what happens in order for the nitrogen to cycle through living things, the first steps are in the soil. And remember how there are kind of some problems with this diagram. You can see I've covered up one of the arrows here with a little yellow box. And so just to remind you, this is what's happening in the soil. This is the diagram from chapter 37 that has the details on the nitrogen cycle. And so the nitrogen fixation is going to produce ammonia, and then this ammonia is going to acquire a hydrogen ion from the soil to make ammonium. We also have dead organic matter that is being decomposed by other microbes. So the amino acids are going to be ammonified by ammonifying bacteria, and so we get this ammonium. Some plants can take in ammonium. Some plants can only take in nitrate, and so this requires the nitrifying bacteria. And so plants are going to assimilate nitrates or ammonium into their roots. And then of course the nitrogen compounds will be carried through the xylem to their shoot system, and that's where the plants would incorporate them into amino acids. And then, so if your plants have amino acids, then when the animal eats the amino acid, or when the animal eats the plant, then the animal can make amino acids. So then what happens when humans get involved and we start fixing nitrogen with industrial processes, and we start enriching the soil with nitrogen by adding industrially produced fertilizers, then you can reach a critical load. And so you'll remember that a critical load is when the amount of added nutrients, those added nitrogen compounds, can no longer be absorbed by the plants. So if you add more nitrogen than can be absorbed by the plants, then that reaches like the critical load. And that can start damaging ecosystem integrity. And we talked about how excess nutrients like the nitrogen can leach into the groundwater, and so we can get contaminated drinking water, and we can get phytoplankton blooms when the nitrates or other nutrients get into lakes, or a similar thing happens in the ocean, and you can get dead zones. And so we had this picture of a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And remember, this happens because the nutrient enrichment causes a phytoplankton bloom. The phytoplanktons, remember, are autotrophs. They are producers. They are producing food by photosynthesis, but they are limited by the amount of nitrogen. Why do they need nitrogen? They need nitrogen so that they can make chlorophyll, so that they can make all the enzymes they need, like Rubisco, to fix carbon. So if they don't have enough nitrogen, they can't do as much photosynthesis. So if you add nitrogen, all of a sudden these animals can do, sorry, they're not animals, they're plants. They can do a whole lot more photosynthesis, and then that gives them the energy to reproduce like crazy. And so you get just a bloom, a tons and tons actually, of phytoplankton. Well, they don't live forever, so then these phytoplankton organisms die. They sink to the sea floor, they decompose. Decomposers are going to use cellular respiration in the process of decomposition, and that consumes oxygen and releases CO2. But if the oxygen gets consumed, then fish can't live there. And so that's what a dead zone is an area of low oxygen that causes the death of all kinds of animals that would otherwise live there. So any questions about this process? You guys feel free to send things in the chat too. I haven't opened up my chat. Maybe I better do that. Well, I don't see a way to do that. So that must mean that, oh, there it is, chat. Ha. Okay, and so the question that I've received so far has nothing to do with this, and that is the final cumulative? And the answer to that is that there will certainly be cumulative questions. And I hope that you're seeing that as we get to the end of the semester. I'm trying to integrate all the knowledge that we've had. So you can certainly expect cumulative questions, like I consider that minke whale question to be a cumulative integrative question. So you can certainly expect questions like that. The majority of the final will deal with stuff that we've had since the last exam, but certainly there will be cumulative questions. All right. Let's move on from the dead zone, and let's discuss this question. I'm going to throw you guys into breakout rooms, and I would like you guys to discuss this. I left you with this question at the end of Wednesday's lecture, and I would like you guys to just talk it over with your friends. So let me put you guys into breakout rooms. And we've got 22 participants. So how about if I put you into, I'll put you into 7 rooms, and you can discuss this question. How can we reduce nutrient enrichment and its consequences? So go ahead and go into your rooms. Oh, I have to open them. The rooms are open. We'll wait till everybody's back, and then we will find out what you guys talked about. 15 seconds. Noah, nice to see you. I love it when I get to see you guys' faces. All right, so Danielle says the countdown's killing her. So what kinds of things did you guys come up with? What are some things we can do to reduce nutrient enrichment and its consequences? Somebody give us an answer out loud so we can hear each other.
I talked about having plants that maybe absorb the excess nitrogen in the soil and then moving the plants that use the fertilizers farther away from the water so that there's not so much nitrate concentration in the oceans and lakes.
Okay, where would you put these plants to absorb the extra nutrients?
Probably on like the outskirts of the farm, kind of like a barrier maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great answer. So one thing that we are trying to encourage farmers to do is to build or to plant buffer zone vegetation, especially along waterways. So if you've got like a ditch, a drainage ditch where stuff drains from your farm, to build a buffer zone there. So let's see, maybe we could go back to this picture. So if the farmer builds, or I keep saying builds, but if a farmer plants a buffer zone here between the farm field and this lake, then those plants could take in that nitrate, that extra nitrate, and prevent that nitrate from getting into the lake. So that's a great idea. What are some other things that you guys came up with?
I said that we could find a way to possibly like drain the excess materials and the nitrogen and all the stuff that would be like harming the environment, somehow find a way to drain it into like a common area that would avoid it from getting mixed in with outside stuff.
Yeah, I know that on like animal operations, they often have kind of like sludge pits where all the animal excrement goes, and that kind of separates it from the idea is to separate those from the water supply. Yep. What else, what other ideas did you guys have? Did any of you guys talk about maybe using less fertilizer? Or maybe using organic fertilizers so we're not using this industrial fixation process? So if you take that animal excrement, which is going to have a lot of nitrogen in it, and if you use that as a fertilizer, then you're at least reducing this step of industrial fixation, and you would reduce the amount of reactive nitrogen gases we get. And organic nitrates, since there has to be a decomposition process, they are released more slowly into the soil, and maybe the plants can kind of keep up with that. Any other ideas that we haven't mentioned? There might be others. I can't think of them at the moment, but maybe we can move on. So we talked about this. So this leads us up into kind of talking about just other things that are getting into our water supply, not just nitrogen fertilizers. So this figure shows farm animals and their manure, and how the manure will sometimes get into lakes and rivers, which I mentioned. But notice that this figure focuses on pharmaceuticals. And so we use a lot of pharmaceuticals here in the US. That's one of the kind of pros and cons of being a developed country. We have good access to healthcare, including good medicines that help us. But then sometimes we use a prescription for a while, we no longer need it, we have these leftover pills. And what you should do is take those back to a pharmacy and turn those back in so that they can be properly disposed of. But what a lot of people do is they flush them down the toilet. You should never do that, because then the drugs can get into our water supply. So as you can see, these drugs have gotten into the sewage plant that treats the sewage water, And the sewage treatment does catch some of those materials, but not everything. So some of those materials can get into the lakes and rivers and cause contamination. They can get into the phytoplankton or into the fishes. And then this can cause changes to the biology of the fishes. We also use a lot of pharmaceuticals, specifically antibiotics, to treat our farm animals to keep them healthy. And the antibiotics also increase the growth rate of the farm animals. And so then when they process the food they're eating, they don't absorb all of the pharmaceuticals into their cells, and instead some of it goes into their manure. And then if that manure can't all be absorbed by plants, then again, it gets into the lakes and rivers. So pharmaceuticals are kind of a big problem, and the overuse of antibiotics in farm animals is a big problem. And so we have a lot of excess antibiotics getting into our systems, into our water system. All right. And this leads us to just talk in general about toxins in the environment. So if you've read ahead, I haven't assigned this yet, but in your reading assignments for next week, you will read about biological magnification. Maybe some of you guys have already heard of this term. So let's talk about how it happens, biological magnification. This figure illustrates biological magnification of chemicals called PCBs in a Great Lakes food web. So what I'd like you to do is look at this figure and interpret what is happening here. Can you see it well enough to see the numbers underneath each of the organisms? Okay, some of you are nodding. So, oh, and I see that I had a question from one of you about, would there be a way to make the sewage plant more efficient at catching the materials? And so I think environmental scientists are working on better ways of treating sewage. So one thing that we do, like there's different ways of treating sewage, and one way of extracting things from the water is by using organisms and filtering sewage through like beds of soil that you've planted plants in, and then the plants like take up the particles from the sewage into their bodies, and then the plants can be disposed of without that material getting into the water. So I'm sure this is something that environmental scientists are working on, different kinds of sewage treatment. Okay, so let's get back to biological magnification. So as you can see here, and I will just describe it. As you can see here, the phytoplanktons, as they take in PCBs from the water, they're going to end up with a very small amount of these toxins, 0.025 parts per million. And then this just follows the food web. So the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, and that you see there's already a magnification of the amount of the PCBs in their bodies. So the zooplanktons, the levels of PCBs in their body would be 0.123. So notice that you've multiplied the concentration of the toxin. And then the zooplanktons are eaten by little fish called smelt. And notice that again, we have a multiplication, 0.123 parts per million. It's multiplied by about how much? By about 10? Does that seem about right? So you take 0.123 times 10, you'd get 1.23. So it's almost tenfold increase. When you go from the smelt to the lake trout, gosh, that's multiplying by 5 times, so not quite a 10 times increase. By the time you get up into a herring gull, the gull eating the lake trout, so we've got primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer. So the gulls are going to have 124 parts per million. So now we've seen another increase. Why does this magnification happen? That's the explain part of this figure. Why does this biological magnification happen? Go ahead and try to answer this question in your chat. Why is there a magnification as you go up the food chain? Okay, you guys have a lot of good ideas here. So one person said animals are, the organisms are consuming multiple organisms from below, and that's getting at part of the answer. The organisms are getting bigger. That's true. Somebody asked if the PCBs are getting replicated in the animals. That's not happening. The PCBs are non-living. That's just a chemical. But the chemical is, oftentimes these toxins are fat soluble, and so they are getting stored in the fat of the animal. Somebody said there's fewer consumers at each trophic level, so they are consuming more of each level below and retaining more toxin. That is getting really close to the answer I'm looking for. Do you guys remember the energy pyramid idea? So remember that organisms at the bottom of the pyramid, they're only able to pass on 10% of their energy to the next trophic level. So that means each trophic level has to eat lots and lots of organisms at the level below it in order to get enough energy. So remember the rule of 10. If only 10% of the energy is available to the next energy level, that also means you're going to have approximately a tenfold magnification of a toxin in each trophic level, and you can see that happening. You can see that at each level you're almost multiplying by 10. So so this is directly related to the energy pyramid idea. So this is bad news if you're a top carnivore, right? And so this often causes the top carnivores to not be able to lay eggs, like not be able to successfully lay eggs, or to lay eggs that are not healthy and won't survive. All right, let's do a clicker question, i.e. a chat question. So which of the following is an example of biological magnification? More seconds if you haven't yet answered. Okay, so most of you said C, which is the correct answer. I didn't fool most of you with my other choices there. All of these are important problems in our environment. And the one that is an example of biological magnification is DDT accumulating in tissues of pelicans, ospreys, and eagles. And you may have heard of Rachel Carson How many of you guys have heard of Rachel Carson? A lot of people shaking their heads. So she wrote a classic book called Silent Spring back in the, I want to say 60s, 1960s. And that really kind of started the environmental movement in the US. And she pointed out this problem of DDT accumulating in tissues of the top carnivores, the pelicans, ospreys, and eagles. And DDT, I think DDE is a breakdown product of DDT. And both of these chemicals interfere with the hormones, actually the sex hormones in animals, and also they inhibited the ability of these pelicans, ospreys, eagles to deposit calcium in their eggs, and so they would lay eggs that had very brittle shells, and so these eggshells would break and the baby birds would die. And so eagles almost went extinct. But we stopped using DDT, and eagles have made a dramatic recovery. So like I see an eagle about once a month just out my window here. It's awesome. And you guys probably have seen eagles. We have lots of eagles along the Mississippi River, and every time I see one, it's awesome. So that is biological magnification. Okay, now let's move into the carbon cycle and how human activities affect the carbon cycle. So remember our carbon cycle, remember the processes in the carbon cycle, and you guys have spent most of this semester learning about the cycling of carbon and energy through ecosystems. So we spent some time talking about photosynthesis and then how the plant transports photosynthates, which would be molecules made by the process of photosynthesis, sugars, through its body. And then we also spent a lot of time talking about cellular respiration. Notice cellular respiration happens in plants. All of these animals, also decomposers, which are not shown here, all of these do cellular respiration to return CO2 to the atmosphere. What do humans do? What human activities affect the carbon cycle? Write your answer in the chat. What human activities affect the carbon cycle? All right, I love your answers. I'm loving it. So many of you guys are saying burning of fossil fuels, which is very clear from the figure. So burning fossil fuels, what are the fossil fuels? Coal, oil, natural gas. Those are fossil fuels. We extract them from the ground and we turn what used to be an inaccessible organic material into accessible. We pump it into the atmosphere. We also burn a lot of wood. A lot of people around the world use wood in their stoves for cooking and to heat their houses. So we burn a lot of wood. We cut a lot of trees and burn them. When we cut trees and burn them, this also reduces the amount of photosynthesis that's possible and also contributes to the buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. Many of you mentioned driving. So driving your car is another way of burning fossil fuels. And by the way, I just have to report to you guys, on my phone, I got my report from Google of my activity levels, and I saved it because I was really proud of it. This has never happened to me before. My Google Maps timeline tells me that I only visited one place, which is kind of funny, during April. And that was a gas station. I was out on a walk and I had to go to the bathroom, so I went into a gas station. But other than that, I've been letting my husband do all the shopping, so I haven't even gone shopping. And I drove my car 21 miles because I drove over to campus one day. Must have been the day that I filmed your field trip. So if you haven't watched the field trip, I hope you enjoy that. I had a great time doing that. But here's what I'm proud about. I walked 38 miles and I rode my bike 33 miles. So I walked and rode my bike more than I drove my car, which like never happens. So I did a good thing for the atmosphere. So there you have it. Okay, now Dykstra's done bragging for the moment. So we are contributing to a buildup of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so let's do this clicker question, i.e. chat question. Ooh, somebody also mentioned using limestone to make concrete. That's perfect. Yeah, there's calcium carbonate that is stored and we use that to make concrete. Awesome. So since 1960, atmospheric CO2 levels have done what? Okay, we're getting several different answers. Okay, I'll give you 5 more seconds to weigh in on this. Okay, so nobody said remained approximately constant. I kind of set you up for that because I said we are accumulating CO2 in the atmosphere. So I'm glad you guys noticed that. But some of you said 10, some of you said 20, some of you said 30%. Let's see if we can figure out what is the right answer. This graph is known as the Keeling curve. It's named after a scientist whose last name is Keeling, who started measuring carbon dioxide concentration in, you can see before 1960, at an observatory in Hawaii called the Mauna Loa Observatory. And Keeling or other people, since Keeling stopped doing the work, have continued measuring carbon dioxide levels all the way to today. I think I downloaded this, if you see over here, I downloaded this last April. So I didn't take the time to download a current one for this, but you can see what's happened in the atmosphere. So, so I don't have it up through to 2020, but you can kind of maybe extrapolate and say in 2020, the parts per million would be about, what's it look like? About, let's say it's 450. Let's say 450. And in 1960, it was less than 320. So let's say maybe, oh no, it's not 450, is it? Let's say it's looks like 410. It looks like each one of these tick marks is 10. So 410 in 19, or in, yeah, let's say 410 in like 19 or 2019, and let's say maybe 315. Does that seem about right in 1960? So let's see if we can do this math. Okay, so to get a rate, we're gonna do 410 minus, what did we say was the beginning amount?
315.
Let's say 315, 410 minus 315 and that gives us 95. So the difference is 95 parts per million. And how do we get a % increase from that?
Divide it by 315.
Divided by our original amount. So divide by 315, and that gives us 30%. So that might be surprising to you guys, but the increase since 1960 has been 30% increase in CO2. It's still a very small percentage of the atmosphere. Only, so it went from less than 320 parts per million. Now it's over 400 parts per million. It's a big % increase, but it's still less than 1% of the atmosphere. So why is this a big deal? Okay, so we calculated the %. Why is this a big deal? Well, what has happened with the global temperature at the same time?
It's increased.
So hopefully you can see a correlation. This is only up through 2015 in your textbook, but you can see that there is a lot of up and down in temperature. We still get very cold winters in Minnesota. That's called weather, not climate. Climate would be this long-term trend that we are seeing. So as you can see, even though we have, you know, high temperatures, low temperatures, if we follow the trend, and I think you can just kind of follow this with your eye, the temperature is going up along with the CO2. Now, how much is it going up? We've got an average temperature, average global temperature of about 13.9 in 1960, and it's gone up to 14.6. So, you know, big whoop, what, right? Half a degree. Is that making a difference? Well, we shall see. So, how does rising CO2 cause global warming? What do you think? Is this just a correlation, or is there some causation here? What do you guys think? Why don't you just put yes or no into the chat so I know what you're thinking? Does rising CO2 cause global warming? Or if yes or no is too black and white for you and you think there's a gray area in between, you can say that too. And some of you are saying undecided. Okay, some of you guys are saying there are other factors. Okay, and one person said greenhouse effect, right? Well, that's where we're going. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you back into your breakout rooms, and somebody needs to open up a whiteboard for you guys to work on. And remember, the way you do that is you hover your pointer, your mouse, over your controls, and you click on share screen and you share a whiteboard, and then you can write on that and try to make a model that explains the greenhouse effect. So I am going to throw you into your breakout rooms, and the breakout rooms are now open. All right. How'd it go with your models? Did you feel like you knew what you were doing? I don't think I've asked you to read about that yet, have I? So so I was kind of throwing you out there and seeing what you guys could come up with. So here is a model from your textbook, and I'm going to kind of fill in some labels here. But what we have down here at the bottom is the Earth, which is not labeled. And then here we have the atmosphere, And then out here we have space. So we start here with,
That's why you're eating your fat.
by the way, Sam, could you mute
No, I actually.
Sam Upton? Thank you. Okay, so we're starting with solar radiation passing through the atmosphere, the Earth's atmosphere. Radiation coming from the sun is high energy radiation, and so it easily penetrates through the atmosphere, most of it. Some of that energy is going to bounce off the atmosphere and go back into space. So that's this first squiggly arrow there. But much of that radiation gets through in and is absorbed at the surface of the Earth, and that warms up the Earth. Some of this solar radiation just bounces off and goes back out into space. But some of the radiation that comes up from the Earth is actually longer waves and therefore lower energy. And a lot of that bounces off the atmosphere and reflects back to the Earth. So this energy is emitted as heat or infrared radiation. And a lot of that energy is trapped, we say, by greenhouse gases and retained in the atmosphere or reflected back down to Earth. And so this is the process of, this is what is known as the greenhouse effect. And if you increase this step 4, if you increase the trapping of heat by the greenhouse gases, that is what warms the Earth. So we have seen an increase, a dramatic increase, a 30% increase in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere that has trapped more heat, and that is what is warming the Earth. And we know that the Earth is warming. That's an established fact that the Earth is getting warmer. There are some ups and downs, but the Earth has gotten warmer by about 0.5 degree Celsius. And so how much is 0.5 degree? Well, it's only 1 degree Fahrenheit. It's a little bit more than that. So it doesn't seem like a big deal, but that much change, remember, that's an average over the entire world. So that means everywhere, like if we average out all the ups and downs all over the world, we still get this increase in temperature, which it actually requires a lot of increase in heat to get that much of a bump in temperature. Seems like a small bump, but there are consequences. So what are some of the consequences of global warming? You guys have heard about global warming. So what are some of the consequences that you guys have heard about? Put these into the chat. What are some consequences that you've heard about of global warming? So a lot of you guys are talking about melting ice caps. That's kind of been the poster child for global warming. Melting of glaciers, melting of polar ice caps, and then the polar bears are running out of habitat. So that's been kind of a poster child. But some of you are also talking about stuff like worsening disasters like storms, melting of glaciers causing other animals to lose their homes. Some places in the world, like in the Andes, some cities rely on melt water from glaciers to provide all of their drinking water. So I'm thinking specifically of the city of Quito in Ecuador, which relies on a glacier on the top of Mount Cotopaxi for its rainwater. And that glacier is shrinking, and they are concerned about how they're going to get drinking water for that city of a couple million people once that glacier is all gone. So 1 degree temperature rise across the world is leading to increased sea level, partly because ice is melting, but also partly because as the ocean warms, the ocean expands. As water gets warmer, it expands. And so that is causing increasing sea level. And then some of you guys said worsening disasters like storms. And some of you said drought, fires, floods. One person said cancer, and that might be, you might be thinking of increased skin cancer because of thinning of the ozone layer, which is actually a separate process, and we'll talk about that next week. Okay, so as Christians, what should our response be? I'm going to put this off for next week. I'm going to ask you this question next week, but let's look at some effects. So warming temperatures cause effects at all levels of the all the levels of ecology that we've been talking about. So at the cellular level, for example, some pine trees are able to make less resin, and the resin is like that sticky sap stuff that they produce that protects them from insects that are getting in. So if the resin cells can't make resin, then that makes the trees more susceptible to pests like pine beetles. And then you can see that this has caused the death of a bunch of trees. Pine trees don't normally change colors. So these are dead trees, all this brown in this picture. At the level of organisms, this is a pika, which is an animal that lives up at high elevations in the mountains, like in Colorado. And they spend more time in their burrows to avoid heat, and that means they have less time out to forage for food. And so that means they may not survive. And so what you want to look at here are the red dots. These are populations that have gone extinct. And what we want to do is look at the mean summer temperature on the x-axis. And you can see as mean summer temperature gets above 12 degrees Celsius and increases, that increases the number of these populations that go extinct. So this is affecting the individuals at the organism level, but this can also affect populations. So the populations of the pikas are going extinct. And then also sometimes the effects have different effects on like different levels of the energy pyramid, so different trophic levels. So here we have the effect on two different populations, the effect on caribou and the effect on a plant that the caribou eats. So the caribou populations migrate based on the weather. The plants germinate and grow based on the weather. Usually the caribou are going to be migrating and giving birth at about the same time that these plants are sprouting, so these plants are available for them to eat. But you can see that in several years here, in 2003, there was a mismatch in when the plants started growing, which is shown over here on the right side, y-axis, and in the red dots. and when the calving of the caribou happens. So see this mismatch. And here's another big mismatch of days of the year. And then here's another big mismatch in 2008. Here's another in 2010. So these mismatches might mean that the caribou don't have enough food to eat right at a really critical time when they're giving birth. And so as you can imagine, this could affect their ability for these calves to survive. And then another example here is effect at the community and ecosystem level. So here's a sea urchin, these kind of black pincushiony looking things. These are sea urchins. These are not plants, they're animals. And they require temperatures above 12 degrees Celsius to reproduce successfully. So notice there's a big uptick in reproduction up above 12 degrees Celsius. And so you can have much more sea urchin reproduction than would have otherwise happened as the sea temperature rises. If you have too many sea urchins, they eat too much of the kelp, and then these kelp forests go away. And these kelp forests are important habitats for a lot of organisms. So if the kelp community gets destroyed by having too many sea urchins, then you get these urchin barrens, and a lot of effect on communities. So these are some examples of some things that are happening due to climate change. Are there effects in Minnesota? Yes, there's a web page here, and I will just go to this quickly. I know we're running out of time, and we'll see if this will come up. Hey, there we go. So this is NPR. Yeah, I don't want to give to you NPR. So actually I did last week. But climate change in Minnesota, this was published by Minnesota Public Radio in 2015, but 23 signs of climate change in Minnesota. Number one, it's warmer. So here's a graph showing temperatures going up in Minnesota. This is average annual temperature, 1895 through 2014. Winters are warming faster. So here's the increase in winter temperature. You can see there's a lot of variation, but this is still the trend. And this is the trend in a couple of cities. Number four, cold nights are on the decline. So what's happening is our overall average temperature is rising, but especially our nighttime temperatures are rising. And the north of the state is warming faster. So this graphic is showing different parts of the state where there's a bigger increase in temperature, and we're seeing that it's happening more in the north than in the south. And we are seeing that pattern so that the Arctic is much more affected than down by the equator. So that's not just a Minnesota trend. It's raining more. And you can see these maps. This is 1891 to 1920, less than 20 inches out here, greater than 30 inches. Notice that now more of the state gets more moisture. So it's raining more than it did a century ago. There's another graph that shows that. That's Waseca. Also, mega rains are more frequent. So you can see here on the x-axis kind of historic mega rain events, and they're kind of scattered through the 60s, and then starting in about 1970, we started getting more and more of these mega rain events. So worse storms. Big storms generate more rain, and there's a graphic across the country of increases in rain events. And this kind of goes on, and we're running out of time. Oh, ice melts earlier. So here you can see like the ice melt, the ice out date on Lake Osakis. Growing season lasts longer. That's a good thing. hardiness zones are moving north. So now you can plant something that would ordinarily you would have only planted in Iowa, and now you're able to plant that in southern Minnesota. So the plant hardiness zones are moving. So we have a lot of evidence that climate has changed. And one question from one of you is, how might new technology affect how we are able to track rainfall, temperature, etc.? So that's a really good question, Josh. And we've run out of time to address it today, but new technology definitely does help us track climate change, like from satellites. And we have a lot of remote sensing, and so that's very helpful. All right, thanks you guys. Thanks for hanging in to the end. I love seeing your faces. I hope you're all doing well. Feel free to reach out to me at any time with an email. We can always set up a chat if you have questions about things. I will see you next Monday on a virtual lecture, and then next Friday we'll have another live lecture. So have a great weekend, and keep up with all your stuff. Bye-bye. Froggy says bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have a live lecture? Do we have a virtual lecture on Wednesday as well? Then?
Yeah, we'll have virtual lectures Monday and Wednesday.
Okay.
Not non-synchronous. And then we'll have a live virtual lecture on Friday.